If you're not involved in a care group, I would encourage you to do that. I know some of you have been asking me about care groups and been asking about where they meet and different ways to get involved. I've had several questions about it. Fred will be getting you a list pretty soon of where all of those groups meet so that if you're not involved in a group, you can find a group to be part of. And also, this is the first Sunday I've preached on kind of like a red carpet. Well, it's kind of pink, but it's kind of red carpet. So this is up here because tonight we are going to have our first annual Academy Awards at Clarksville Highway with a red carpet. I think I have several dates lined up, by the way. I hope they know who they are. I think we're giving away like 40-something awards for people who are in different aspects of our Wednesday night study. So be here tonight and support them. And some of you, a lot of you, will actually be getting an award. We just asked you do not have very long acceptance speeches because we want people to bring a dessert to have a dessert after that. And I don't want to delay my dessert because you want to have a long-winded. All right, so got that out of the way. Imperfect church. 1 Corinthians as we do a study on that. And I don't mean imperfect in the fact that they weren't forgiven by Jesus. We talked about that last week. They were forgiven. They were holy, but they were imperfect because they were a group of people. And a group of people meeting together, we understand that's kind of imperfect. They had a lot of problems. They had a lot of things in their society that they were trying to battle, which are the very same things in our society that we're trying to battle. So it's a very contemporary message about how the church interacts with the world. Last Sunday, I asked a question in the elders' meeting. It wasn't just my question, it was a question of all the elders. And it's, I know that I'm one of the elders, but I don't want to speak for the elders today, so I'm just going to speak as Greg. Okay, so this is not a question from the eldership, this is a question for Greg, but this is one of the questions I had on my mind. It bothers me sometimes when I look at our church and I think, why are we not growing exponentially with our community? Because our community, I mean, if you haven't noticed that, it is really growing. I mean, you can see people moving in. I don't see very many people moving out. I see a lot of houses being built. I have to sit longer and longer at the end of my driveway to be able to get out on the highway because there's so many more cars. If you've never been on Highway 41A at this church building when they have a wreck on the interstate, you do not know how many people drive from here to Nashville every day because traffic, sometimes it's just backed up for miles. And you look at the way our community is growing, and sometimes I sit and think, why isn't our church growing kind of at least at the same ratio? And I don't, if we knew the answer to those questions, I'd be able to tell you, right? And some of you might have comments or suggestions about that, and I'm just telling you that me personally, I'd love to sit down and hear all of the suggestions you have about that. But then as I began to study for this lesson this morning, as I've been doing that over the last few months, I realized something. Sometimes we trust in the wrong things. Sometimes we think that we can figure it out, that we're smart enough to discern it, or that if we could have a different way of doing something, or we could think of a more creative way of doing something, maybe that's what we need to do. And we've done different things like through the years that were really good about the way that we impacted the community. We used to do a Father's Day barbecue. And I mean, it was a lot of fun, it was a lot of work, but it brought a lot of people in. We've done Trail of Treats, and bless Coleman's heart, Coleman's going to call me this week again, and he's going to tell me how many days it is to Trail of Treats. Coleman calls me about once every 2 weeks. I don't complain about that. It's always a great phone call. Coleman will call and you'll say, it's X number of days to Trail of Treats, Mr. Greg. I'm going to come and I'm going to sing Long Black Train because Houston's going to let me sing Long Black Train. So Coleman's coming, Trail of Treats, sing Long Black Train. He also has some candy he's going to give out. Now, you think about that and you think, well, if we were just smart enough, or we think it's on our own ability. You know, if I could speak better, or if I knew what to say better, or if I had a better way of doing things, or if I felt more confident about something, and you start thinking that, well, The church only grows because of these natural abilities that we have. And some of you have some really good natural abilities in certain areas. Some of you are great speakers. Some of you are good teachers. Some of you are good with administration tasks. And we're going to go all through these in a couple of lessons from now, okay? Some of you are really good with administration tasks. Some of you are great about extending mercy to other people. There are some people sitting in this fellowship this morning who are incredible prayer warriors for people. There are some of you that just have the natural ability just to talk to people. You just have that gift. Some of you are just approachable. There are all of these gifts that we have, and some of them are natural, and some of them are Spirit-given. And we look at that and we think, man, if we could just... But the thing is, it's not if we could do something, we misplace the power. And we misplace the power in us instead of in God. And so in 1 Corinthians, especially chapters 2, 3, and 4, Paul is talking about this power that they have for the gospel. And I don't know what's happening, but my little clicker is not working. So the church exists and thrives by God's power, not by human ability. We don't personally have the ability to cause that to happen or to make anything happen. We don't have, it's not like Greg has the right kind of speaking ability to make somebody react a certain way at a certain time. It doesn't work that way. I mean, I've told y'all my story about when I first started preaching, right? When I first started preaching, every time I preached, I passed out. And I know some of you are thinking, well, I wish you'd start doing that again because we get about 10 minutes, you pass out, we'll be done. Well, it doesn't work that way. I learned to bounce around like a rabbit, so I didn't pass out anymore. That's why I jump around like I do. And you look at that, but does it have to do with my ability to sit down and come up with the right word and the right phraseology? And it doesn't. It doesn't. Nor does it depend on you. So this is what Paul says, 1 Corinthians chapter 2, since I can't make this work, we'll forget that. And when I came to you, brothers, this is chapter 2, verse 1, I did not come proclaiming to you the testimony of God with lofty speech or wisdom. For I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and Him crucified. And I was with you in weakness and in fear and with much trembling. My speech and my message were not in wise, persuasive words, but a demonstration of the Spirit and of power, so that your faith might not rest on the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. Have you ever thought maybe if you could hear Paul preach, you could have really heard something? Y'all think, well, I wish we could get Paul preaching here instead of Greg. He had to be some kind of speaker. Well, he probably was, but don't you really appreciate what he said? Man, I came to you with weakness, fear, and trembling. Does that sound like somebody who is just overly confident in their ability? Does it sound kind of like you might feel if on the way up to speak on Sunday morning, I said, hey, why don't you take my spot? Would you come up with confidence or with fear and trembling? Paul said, look, when I came to you, it wasn't wise, persuasive words, but did you get why? The so that phrase. I wish I could make this work. Can y'all fix me back there, Travis, and give me a couple of slides? So that your faith might not rest in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. That's the key. The key is it rests in the power of God. So if we ask questions about how the church interacts with the world, we have to ask God about those questions. And I phrase it like this. Sometimes we just need to get out of God's way. Sometimes we need to let God do what God has the power to do, and we need to stop restricting God because we think we have the power to do it. I love the men that I serve with as elders at Clarksville Highway. And I think they're all exceptional men. But I'm going to tell you a secret, okay? They have their limitations. We have our limitations. We're limited in how much we know. We're extremely limited on how far we can see into the future. We're extremely limited in sometimes just looking at our community and asking the question, what does our community need? Sometimes we're even limited on how we approach, not only people outside the church, but even people within the church. Where do we get that power? Where do we get that ability? We go to leadership training. We do a lot of different things that would help us, but ultimately, all of that power has to come from God. And one of the ways that you get out of God's way is you start resting on God's ability to work through you than in your own ability. Because sometimes your ability is just not enough. And God designed it that way. That's why there are spiritual gifts. There's natural gifts and spiritual gifts. Are you supposed to use your natural gift for the glory of God? Y'all do like this. That's a yes, right? If God gave you natural ability, you need to use that natural ability for the glory of God. But you also have ability that's just not natural ability, it's spirit ability, because God gives gifts in the church. It's a later lesson, but I need you to hang on to it. God gives gifts in the church for His purpose so that the church can be edified. So sometimes what has to happen is you have to get out of God's way and let God do through you what He gives you the ability to do, but not what you think you can do. And you think, well, Greg, that all sounds like really nice and fluffy, but what does that look like? You know, it might look like you standing in this pulpit instead of me one Sunday. It might look like you going and ministering to somebody who's in a hospital when you feel uncomfortable about going into a hospital and visiting with somebody. I have found in life that it's the places that we don't feel adequate where God has the ability to use us the most. Because we're not trusting in ourselves, we're trusting in Him. We have to get out of the way and let God use His wisdom instead of us using our wisdom. Instead of us figuring out exactly what needs to happen and how things need to go, we need to step back and ask God, okay, God, where are you wanting to lead this church? And what does this church need to do? Because that's what Paul is saying. Look, your faith doesn't rest on people, on a person, on a human. Your faith rests in God. There will be a time, and I don't know when it will be. Hopefully it's still 4 or 5 years down the road, right? Because my 25-year contract's not up yet. But there will be a day that I don't preach here. That I won't be your quotation mark preacher. That doesn't mean I still won't be here, but I won't be your preacher. Somebody else will be your preacher. Might be Grant. I don't know. Somebody be your preacher. But does your faith rest on me being your preacher? It's okay, y'all. No, absolutely not. What does your faith rest on? Faith rests on God. There will be a day that the elders who are elders now will not be your elders. There will be people who are sitting in this auditorium, most likely, who are your elders when we're not your elders. Does your faith rest in your elders? No. Your faith rests in God. Now, Jeff's younger than me. He may be here another 50 years, right? I don't know how that's going to work out. But does your faith rest in Jeff? No. Your faith rests in God, not human wisdom. I'm a firm believer that what we need most of the time is just simply more prayer. We simply need to honestly ask God, what are we supposed to be doing? But it's not just asking, it's listening and paying attention. And you look out in our world and you say, well, and when you start asking about church attendance, people say this, well, people don't go to church like they used to. Statistically, if statistics are right, I read a statistic one time on a napkin in a restaurant. It says 43.8 of all statistics are made up. I'm like, well, that's interesting. That's an interesting napkin, isn't it? That's pretty cool. And so you look at that, and so we do surveys, right? And we do statistics, and we try to figure it out. And if you look at all the data that's out there, do less people attend church now than they did 20 years ago? Yes. Do less people attend church now than they did 10 years ago? Yes. 5 years ago? Yes. And so we wring our hands and say, well, the reason attendance is down is because people just don't go to church anymore. Here's my thing, right? I've been thinking about this. If there are fewer people going to church, there are more people that we can reach. Right? It's like if everybody quit buying cars, that gives me more people to sell a car to. That's an exciting thing, right? Because you've got more opportunity. So then you start scratching your head and say, well, the church just doesn't appeal to people anymore. Well, why doesn't it appeal to people? And the church proclaims God's mystery. I talked about this in Sunday school class, and it's a really cool concept. It's a mystery. Mystery is something that's hard to understand. A mystery is not something that you grasp the first time around. A mystery is something that has to be explained to you, like a magic trick. Even though the gospel is not a magic trick, that's just an example, right? It'd be messing me up and getting me cast out because I compared the gospel to a magic trick. But you can see a magic trick that looks really complicated till somebody explains it to you, and you say, huh, that looked awful easy, didn't it? But until you knew, you didn't know. And God comes along with this mystery about Jesus and salvation, and the world looks at it, and it's a mystery. It's not one of those things that you just instantly grasp, and the church proclaims that mystery. So when you go proclaim something and somebody doesn't understand it, don't say, wow, I must have really messed that up. No, it's a mystery. Sometimes it takes a little while to explain it. But this is the other thing about a mystery, and the gospel being a mystery to a church and to a world that is not really looking for the mystery of God. And people don't always know what they really need. And I think a lot of times when I go out in the world and I'm talking to people about salvation in Jesus, they don't realize that they need that the way that they need it. And we sit in church and we talk about having an eternal perspective on things, and some people don't understand what it means to have an eternal perspective. And God wraps all of that up in this mystery of the gospel that's not by human wisdom, but it is by God's power. And I think it really is evident in what Paul writes in a couple of things. First he says, but we have not received the spirit of the world, but the Spirit who is from God, that we may understand what God has freely given us. So how is it that we understand? How is it that it begins to make sense to us? It's the Spirit of God working in us that helps us make sense out of it. You know, when Paul writes things like, and you read these in 1 Corinthians, we're just not sermonizing on them, okay? They're spiritual things, and only people with spiritual minds can understand the things that are spiritual, and the physical can't understand the spiritual. And now we have this Spirit from Jesus who helps us understand spiritual things. It helps us discern the things in life that are really important. So I want to illustrate it this way. This is a map of Corinth. And I know you can't see that map a lot from where you are, and we're going to blow this map up in another couple of sermons from now so you can see something really important. But if you were to look at this map and you can see that red dot. Can y'all see that red dot? Right there, right in the middle, right here. That spot right there. That's the Temple of Apollo. And that's about where it would have sat in ancient Corinth. When Diane and I went there several years ago, I don't know how many years ago it's been now, but this is a picture that we took of the Temple of Apollo that's in Corinth. And you say, well, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, like 6 things still standing there, right? Well, not all 6 of those are really from the Temple of Apollo from the 1st century. Some of those have been kind of reconstructed so tourists like me would have something to look at when we went over there. But some of them might be original. There was this really cool thing that I thought happened every pagan temple that we went to. Every pagan temple that we went to that I can remember, on one of those columns had a dove sitting there. And you'd walk up to that pagan temple and you hear the dove go, make the little dove sound. I'm not going to do that for you because it won't sound cool, right? But they make the little dove sound. And I saw that dove sitting on top of one of those pillars, pretty much, one of those columns at almost every temple. Did you see that, Houston? Did you see doves sitting on top of them? And the only thing I could think of was this. When the Holy Spirit descended, what did it descend as? Form of a dove. And I was sitting there and I would listen to that little dove coo, and in my mind it was God saying, well, that didn't last long, did it? But I'm still here. Because here I am. But if you were in Corinth and you were walking around and you lived in that city, you would see this temple standing there in all of its incredible majesty. Now, I don't know exactly what it would look like. Some people have done reconstructions, and somebody did this reconstruction and said, this is what the Temple of Apollo, if we put it all back together, it would look like that. And if you lived in that city and you saw that temple, and if remember that map, it's almost like right in the middle of the city, isn't it? And you would see that temple in the middle of the city, and you would think, if you were grown up in that city, that's where Apollo reigns. That's his temple. And it's magnificent. And it's incredible. And it's beautiful. And then God, in all of his wisdom, comes along and he creates a new temple. It's not built like that. It doesn't have magnificent columns. It doesn't have that type of built pomp and splendor. Some people might look at it and not even realize when they look at it the magnificence of what they're seeing. Because God could have. He could have given instructions to build a building which would have been unlike any other building of the world, because he is the master architect. And if you remember in the Old Testament, he did it before, didn't he? When Solomon built his temple, what was that temple like? It was incredible. When Herod came along and he wanted to make the temple bigger, and you got the Herodian temple, what did it look like in Jerusalem? It was incredible. I mean, just think of a building, and everything on the inside is overlaid with gold. Everything is just formed exactly perfect. It's the perfect dimensions and the perfect size and the perfect look and the perfect place. God could have done that and said, this is where I live, this is where I dwell. But he didn't. He didn't. He built something that is so much greater, most of the time it just escapes us. Don't you know that you yourselves are God's temple? Now, there's a way that Paul says this in a couple of sermons from now, that the you yourselves is going to be individually. Okay, where he's talking about you being a temple. Right now, this, and both of them are plural, but right now he's not talking about you individually, although you can kind of cross that bridge and get there and it's theologically okay. But you yourselves are God's temple, and that God's Spirit lives in you. And if anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy him. For God's temple is sacred, and you are that temple. The you is not just you individually, it is you plurally. You know what the temple of God looks like? There you are. You are the temple. So somebody's strolling down through the middle of Corinth, and he looks up and he sees that huge temple of Apollo, and he says, wow, man, look at that temple of Apollo. Isn't that cool? That same guy strolls down the streets of Corinth, and he sees a group of believers who are assembled together, and you know what he says? Hey, that's God's temple, not a building. Hey, now is the building nice? I mean, let's be honest, is the building nice? Anybody happy this morning we have air conditioning? It's okay. If it were raining this morning, you glad we're inside? It's kind of sunshiny out there. You glad the sun's not shining down on your head? Amen. You like the building? Has the building got some benefit? If the building went away, are we still the church? Because the building has nothing to do with it. You are God's temple. So when God got ready to construct something that is incredibly beautiful, that the world can't even begin to imagine, you know what he created? A collection of people. Collection of people. And the collection of people are only powerful because the Spirit of God works through that collection of people to accomplish His will in the world. And it's not because we're talented. It's not because we have all the answers. It's not because we're so smart or intelligent or we're so good looking. It is simply because we are the people who allow the Spirit of God to work through them. So what does your faith rest on? Is your preacher? Nope. Is your elders? No. Members of the church that you look at and say, man, that's a really smart guy, or that's really a smart lady. No. Does it rest on people because they have the ability to do certain things, or they have certain skill sets? No. Your faith rests on the power of God. Which leads you to a really hard question. And it's a tough one. And I hope you have to wrestle with it, and I hope you have to struggle with it. I have to wrestle with it and struggle with it. Am I letting God's Spirit and God's power work through me, or am I trying to determine everything by my own wisdom, intelligence, and ability? How do I work? Because Paul says, when you're weak, then you can be strong. When you can lay aside your wisdom and become wise in God, then you truly have wisdom. When can you lay down all of the things that go into the world and you can see things from God's eternal perspective, then you're beginning to get insight into life. Now remember, we said it was an imperfect church, right? It is. Because every one of us are trying to figure out how we allow God's Spirit to work through us with the incredible power that God presents to us. So if you're sitting out there and you're saying, man, I don't really know what my gift to the church is, maybe we need a couple of sermons later, maybe we need to help you find it. Because if you're part of the body, you have the gift to benefit the body. And if you're saying, I don't know what it is, I don't know what God wants me to do, then we listen to God and we allow His Spirit to lead us. If we look at our community and we say, man, I don't know why we're not growing at the same rate that our community is growing. I don't know the answer to that either. Maybe we never will. Maybe it's God's will that we're not. I don't have an answer to that yet. Praying about it, thinking about it. But we step back and we realize, it's not because we can come up with the most creative plans, or we can come up with exactly the way that we're supposed to market ourselves to the community or whatever that means. No, it's because we will rely on the grace and the mercy and the power of God. So this is a sermon about letting go and letting God lead. And the first step in that, if you haven't made that step, is simply you let go of your own life. You step back from life and say, God, I want you to lead me where you want me to go. I want to surrender myself to you. I want to be your disciple. I want to follow you. And when we do that, sometimes it's quite a difficult thing. Sometimes it's quite a difficult thing not to be in control, but to let somebody else have that control. Maybe you tried that path once, you didn't kind of like it, so you went back and took control, and now you need to come back and say, look, you know what? I need to let God have control. Deny yourself, pick up your cross, and follow Jesus. If you need to respond in some way, I'm going to ask you to do that while we stand and sing.